Oh my god, does Greece have a corruption problem? Greece just made history, and not in the good way. It is with the largest corruption fraud case ever in the nation's history. Yeah, you heard me. The Greek government is in crisis after an EU subsidy scandal was revealed that showed that Greek politicians stole around 290 million euro from the European Union, or the equivalent for those that are in the United States of $340 million as of today's exchange rate, considering that the US dollar has taken a bit of a dip in the last month, but that is a whole other story that I'm going to have to talk about here at a later time. Several officials at the top of Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis' center-right government would go and resign on Friday, June 27th, after their names went and appeared on a file from the European prosecutor, implicating them in a massive scheme to defraud the EU's lavish farm budget. Those who resigned were Migration Minister Makis Viridis, Deputy Foreign Minister Tassos, and I'm going to butcher the name on this, Chatsavisilou, along with Deputy Minister of Rural Development Dionysios Statmanidis, Deputy Minister of Digital Governance Christos Pakoros, and Secretary General for Rural Development and Food Giorgos Stratakos. Again, this entire episode is about to be very painful for the lot of you that understand how to pronounce many of the names. I apologize right now. But yes, the European Public Prosecutor's Office, the EPPO, is pursuing dozens of cases in which Greeks went and received EU agricultural funds for pasture land that they did not own or lease, or for agricultural work that they just never did in the first place, thereby depriving legitimate farmers of the funds that they deserved. And as said previously, this totaled around 290 million euro or 340 million US dollars. Making it the largest corruption fraud scandal in all of Greek history. And of course, this happens like a month after I made a video on how, Greece finally seems like it's starting to get out of debt. And mind you, that is saying something here. You see, my friends, Greece has a little bit of a corruption problem, and that is going to be the subject of today's video. Over the years, in singular cases, hundreds of millions of euro at any given time have been stolen in one shape or form throughout the country in singular large cases, just like what we have gone and described. Though this case was like 35, 40, 45 million euro that would happen every single year for several years. But the bigger problem by far in Greece is the general atmosphere of corruption and fraud that, although, yes, it has considerably improved today, as in within the past decade or so, this is something that has been a consistent problem over the years. You see, corruption in Greece is considered to be very significant, with the country ranking as one of the most corrupt in the European Union, according to the Corruption Perception Index. Which, for those of you who haven't looked at this before, it's a rather useful tool to use when looking at general perceptions of corruption around the world, but it is also a great tool to see just how things have actually changed over time, with countries being rated from a scale of 1 to 100, with 1 being extremely corrupt and 100 being the least corrupt. In Greece's case, there has been a lot of improvement over the past decade. But similar to what happens on a sports team when someone gets the Most Improved Player award, the implication that they have there is, they were just that bad in the first place, and it doesn't mean that they are any good now. They're just the most improved. After all, in simple math, you have doubled your points if you go from 1 to 2, a 100% increase versus someone increasing their score from 71 to 82, which is a much bigger increase in actual numerical value, just not percentage-wise. In Greece's case, it was not a score of 1 becoming 2. That is way too harsh, but using the Corruption Perception Index as a reference, you could go and see that Greece rose from 36 points in 2012 to 49 points for 2024, making it the least corrupt EU member in the Balkans, which is good. But that is also down from its high of 52 in 2022, and honestly, considering its latest scandal, it is probably going to end up dropping even more this year. Either way, Greece still has one of the biggest corruption problems in the entire EU, and that is probably something that we're going to be tackling here for future videos for other nations and what it is that they are dealing with. Transparency International would state in 2012 that corruption had played a major role in causing the Greek financial crisis. Tax evasion was described by Greek politicians as a national sport, and no, that's a real quote, with up to 30 billion euro per year being simply uncollected, according to a 2012 estimate. This is the point where Greece had a score of only 36. So it is here then, my friends, as always, that we have to kind of sit down and ask ourselves, how is it that we got here? And also, what is going to happen next? Are we going to dive then back through thousands of years of Greek history to explain corruption? No, God, no. I may be crazy, I understand, I know my reputation, but that is not what it is that I am going to do here. No, instead we simply need to go back by around 200 years, but this is necessary for a brief moment because it does really set the stage for why corruption became so incredibly common and pervasive amongst Greek society. Only then are we going to go into some of the other scandals that have rocked Greece in the past several decades, and you can see how this is not something that is new, this is just a trend. And so, my friends, because there is so much corruption in this world, that is why it is important to understand where it is that you are getting your information from, which is exactly why I am proud to be sponsored by Ground News. Not only am I grateful for Ground News being a longtime sponsor of this channel, which they have been, but simultaneously I am grateful to them for being a news source that I can actually remove some of my own biases, or at least check my biases at the door when trying to analyze the information in order to be able to present things to you all. Because when talking about things related to this farming scandal is just an example, I can see who exactly is talking about this, what their bias is in regards to political affiliation, what their factuality rating is, and one of my personal favorite details, who actually owns said media source. Because this is the thing that a lot of people don't even realize when looking at media, is that there is a key difference between when something is done by private journalists versus a government-owned news source. And when that government is corrupt and applying pressure to the media, you don't know exactly what it is that you are going to get. Because look, I'm going to be blunt with you all. There is bias in just about every single media source that you consume. Hell, I have my own biases. That is something that is true. Though I do everything possible to try and remove said biases and to present things in as neutral of a manner as I can. Most sources that you get just off the internet don't even bother doing that. So it's important that you know specifically where news is coming from. Genuinely, I can't praise Ground News enough. So by all means, if you want to support this channel and more importantly, you want to support yourself and actually learn things about the world, go to groundnews.com/historyofeverything and get 40% off the Ground News Vantage plan. This is the same plan I use, and if you want to get it for 40% off, go and click my link down in the description. Do not let yourself be ignorant of the world around you, my friends. You see, corruption in Greece is something that can be traced back to its days under Ottoman rule. I covered this in a previous video, but for around 400 years, the Greek lands were controlled by the Ottoman Turks. Naturally, the Greeks did not like this, and various revolts would take place over the centuries, but not all resistance was violent, which is something that is truly fascinating. Tax resistance became a form of patriotism, literally refusing to pay your taxes, or fudging the numbers to reduce what you did pay. And this wasn't something that was just done for yourself. It was done specifically to hurt the state on purpose. This tended to work because corruption was widespread amongst Ottoman officials, especially in the latter centuries of their rule, meaning you could pay an official under the table a small amount of money, and boom, you did not actually pay taxes to the Ottoman state that year, thus depriving it the revenue that it needed to operate the empire in the first place. It's smart. It is really smart, especially when done on a large scale. However, that all being said, you start to have problems when this practice continues after independence and when a Greek state actually exists. When Greece gained its independence in 1830, many ethnic Greek officials, called Koskotas, retained their positions and continued their corrupt practices, which set a precedent for how the Greek state was going to operate for many decades afterwards. We are, of course, though, going to have to move forward at a rapid pace here now. Throughout the 20th century, Greece would experience political instability, including occupation, civil war, and military dictatorships that we are largely going to end up skipping past here. I covered them more in depth during my previous Greek debt video, where it was more crucial information, but either way, these periods of turmoil would create an environment where corruption could flourish. And oh boy, did it. Political parties often relied on patronage and clientelism in order to maintain power, further entrenching corrupt practices. Friends and family of politicians and officials could get preferential treatment to secure lucrative government contracts. And that, my friends, is something which is sadly a common practice in many places around the world, and I've talked about in a number of the videos that I've done, especially recently with South Africa. Which, of course, then brings us to the first major corruption scandal that we're going to be covering here, the Koskotas scandal. For those of you who have not heard of this before and why it is relevant for today's episode, talking about the government and why it could be brought down, the Koskotas scandal was something that unfolded in Greece during the late 1980s. and it was a very significant political and financial controversy that had far-reaching implications for the country's political landscape and people's trust in institutions. For context, this took place at the beginning of the Third Hellenic Republic, which was established following the collapse of a 7-year junta that had ruled from 1967 to 1974 due to its mishandling of the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, which didn't go well. Constantine Karamanlis would go in return from exile and would lay the foundations for a new republic with the Constitution of 1975. And during that same period, the Greek economy, which had actually outperformed in the previous 2 decades from 1950 to 1973, it did remarkably well. This time it was not going to do that. It began to slow down due to the oil crisis of the 1970s, also causing then a spike in inflation, and then they had to deal with competition upon the country's entry into the European market once it joined in 1981. Again, for more details, we actually covered that in the previous video when talking about how much Greece has fudged its numbers here in the past. So, to describe things as a bit unstable might be putting it a bit mildly. By the end of the decade, Greece's economy was burdened by debt that had nearly tripled in size, rising from 26.7% of GDP in 1981 all the way to 73% of GDP in 1990. Inflation would fluctuate between 13 and 23% from 1981 to 1989, meaning there was no stability in any of the currency. Unemployment would rise from 2.7% in 1980 to 8% by 1988. And on top of all of that, the budget constantly was in a state of deficit due to massive government expenditures in order to keep failing and corrupt companies afloat that would further strain the economy. Yes, this is important to mention here because at the same time that all of these economic crises are going down, press reports of corruption within the socialist government were being reported, with over, and I kid you not, 200 different scandals in the late 1980s alone. Which some of the famous ones among this were the Yugoslav corn scandal, which I'm probably going to end up making a short here on, the mass surveillance scandal, and the public utilities scandal. All of which I could cover, but I do not have the time here considering how long this video is set to be in the first place. Those will probably be shorts. That all being said, however, Prime Minister Papandreou would become embroiled in the Koskotas scandal, which would overshadow all other scandals that PASOK, this being the ruling socialist government name, by the way, was involved in. So what happened? Well, it goes back to this guy that the scandal is named after, George Koskotas. George Koskotas was born in Greece in 1954, and he was a former banker and publisher who rose to prominence in the 1980s. He emigrated to the United States with his family in 1969, and he worked in the construction industry, where he made a bit of a name for himself for being a massive fraud. In 1980, he was indicted for defrauding the IRS and the New York State Unemployment Office, and from there, he went back to Greece. Once he was back in Greece, he got busy. And when I say busy, I mean on the 3rd of July 1979, he went and joined the Bank of Crete's Financial Administration Department, which consisted of the accounting and computing sections. He then rapidly was promoted to different positions, gaining access to the inner parts of the bank, and from 1980 onwards, he started taking large amounts of the bank's money and just placing it into his own accounts. Some of the embezzled money was then used to buy shares of the bank that he was stealing from. He managed to embezzle millions, which he used to gain control of the bank and build his own media empire. This empire included 2 daily newspapers in Athens, 5 different magazines, a radio station, and even the purchase of a soccer team, a football team, Olympiakos FC. The reason he was able to do this so incredibly quickly and easily was due to his political connections, specifically PASOK and its leaders. Later investigations revealed that large sums of money were funneled from the Bank of Crete to support PASOK's activities, and media outlets that were sympathetic to the party. This created a complex web of political and financial corruption that would go on to implicate very high-ranking government officials, but this is not something that was going to last. In June of 1988, the Bank of Greece attempted to audit the Bank of Crete, but Koskotas, fearing that, all of his corruption was going to be revealed, requested a pause on the audit through his political connections. Judicial investigations into the scandal were stalled by the Minister of Justice, Menios Kotsogogias, who naturally would face criticism for his handling of the case. However, things eventually do go through, and Koskotas does get extradited to Greece in 1991 for trial. This trial ends up lasting 9 months and was a massive media spectacle with live broadcasts. Papandreou, despite being a former prime minister here, would then go and exercise his constitutional right to not attend the trial, proclaiming that the entire thing was a giant witch hunt. In the end, though, the political fallout was massive. The scandal led to the resignation of several ministers and demands for a vote of no confidence in the government. A 13-judge court set up by Parliament would go and convict 2 former cabinet ministers of involvement in the scandal, and from there, the political polarization would reach its peak when Parliament indicted Papandreou and 4 of his ministers. The entire government just straight up collapsed. And I bring this case up because when talking about corruption in Greece, this is the prime historical example that one should really start from. The Koskotas scandal is something that eroded public trust in political institutions, and it really highlighted the deep-rooted corruption within the Greek political system as a whole. It became a symbol of the broader issues that you see of clientelism and patronage that continuously plague Greek politics. The financial manipulations and embezzlement had significant economic repercussions, contributing to further economic instability of the period, which is something that when talking about Greece didn't really get that much better. Because, oh, you may be surprised, what's that? Greece and economic instability? No way! Yes, but wait, it gets worse. Because the next scandal that we're going to be bringing up here is the Siemens scandal. And no, hey, you, viewer, commenter, stop looking at me like that. I know the jokes. It's going to be in the comments. I already know. Just hear me out. For those that are somehow unfamiliar, Siemens is a global technology company with a very long history of success, and it did have a very good reputation in the technology industry. However, that being said, it has been involved in several bribery scandals around the world, including this one in Greece that we're going to be talking about. The company has over 430,000 employees and a revenue base of over $77 billion, making it one of Europe's largest technology firms. But our story today here focuses on Greece. And we could easily do a whole series on different corruption scandals within these major companies around the world, but we have to move on. Siemens, you see, has a very long history in Greece, dating back to the founding of the company by Werner von Siemens in 1847, when he pioneered the building of the first international telegraph lines. In the 1920s, Ioannis Volopiotis, who was a Greek engineer, married the daughter of Werner von Siemens and was appointed head of the Athens office of AEG Siemens Telefunken. As a member of the board of directors of Greek Telephone Company Limited, or AETE, and Greek Radio Company Limited, AERE, Volopiotis was going to easily win contracts for the German company. He was the guy that everyone would be able to come to, and as a result, AEG Siemens Telefunken would begin to dominate things. In 1926, they would go and install the first telephone networks in Greece and won the contracts to install new telephone exchanges and new radio facilities. And okay, you're probably then looking at me and wondering, Stack, why are we going all the way back to the 1920s when we literally just got through the 1980s? This seems rather pointless. No, this is setting the stage so you can understand the norm of just how things have been operated in Greece for centuries. Volopiotis, you see, typically would go and pay a fee, right? This is the thing that he was supposed to do. A fee of anywhere between 3 to 5% of the total value of the contracts that he won to the Greek politicians and government officials that were giving them to him in the first place. Meaning if he got a $1 million contract, if you will, he was supposed to give $30,000 to $50,000 directly to that politician that approved it. This money was called the extra fee, and it was paid to bank accounts in Switzerland. Yes, Swiss bank accounts. You can probably see how it's all coming together here. Over the course of the Nazi occupation of Greece from 1941 to 1944, Volopiotis was in charge of all German business in the country, as well as the Greek Radio Authority. When the Nazis were defeated, Volopiotis was actually tried at the special court for Nazi collaborators, together with his colleague, Dr. Nikolaos Christoforakos, who is actually the father of the future and fugitive CEO of Siemens Greece. The two men were acquitted and actually together went and moved to Germany. That wasn't going to last, however. Volopiotis would return to Greece in the 1950s to represent Siemens and to bid again for telephone and radio contracts, as well as for railway tenders. Naturally, he was going to get involved in things. Spiros Markazinis, who was then the Minister of Economic Coordination, would allegedly cut a deal with him for contracts to modernize the telephone and radio network installation across the country. On April 3rd, 1954, Markazinis would go and resign as minister when news of these deals became public. And months later, the German government would even go and force the Greek government to uphold the contracts or risk losing German aid. This is one of those things with foreign companies that actually creates a lot of issues within Greece. In the following months, Volpiotis would then go and accuse Konstantinos Karamanlis as well as Konstantinos Papakonstantinou, the minister and deputy minister of public works respectively, of asking for bribes. The two politicians would then counterattack, accusing Volpiotis of corruption and demanding $1 million in payments to be technical advisor to OTE, the Greek Telecommunications Authority, for 10 years. The case ultimately ended up in court, and Volpiotis was sentenced to 18 months for slander. So fun times, but guess what? In 1956, Konstantinos Karamanlis becomes prime minister, and he goes and grants Siemens a no-bid contract to provide the lion's share of supplies and telecommunication equipment of the Greek state. And for the next 50 years, Siemens would continue to get Greek government contracts all over the place. But perhaps the most controversial contract of this that brings up recent corruption with Siemens was the $325 million joint venture with San Diego-based SAIC in 2002, which would set up a security system for the Olympic Games that would take place in Athens in 2004. This was the Command, Control, Coordination, Communication Integration System, also referred to by the acronym of C4I, which never got off the ground in time. This is where things get suspicious and some real movement begins to happen. Because you see, my friends, in late April of 2005, Greek authorities began to investigate the C4I case. At about the same time, the U.S. Department of Justice also began to investigate Siemens for bribery, working closely with the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office. This huge U.S. investigation would eventually encompass Siemens activities over the course of Venezuela, Iraq, Bangladesh, and Argentina. They were active everywhere and bribing everyone, it seems. As this was happening, a second Siemens contract came under scrutiny from Greek authorities, the supply of telecommunication equipment material to the Hellenic Telecommunications Organization, OTE. Notably, a December 1997 agreement with Siemens to digitize the network for €464.5 million, also known as the 8002 agreement. So what happens, you may wonder? Well, in April of 2006, Podromos Mavridis, the head of the telecommunications department of Siemens Greece, suddenly goes and leaves the company after 18 years of work without offering any explanation publicly as to why. And this being after receiving a €300,000 payoff from the company. In November of that year, lawyers for Siemens would sue Mavridis in Greek courts, accusing him of embezzling €8 million. But it was too late. A year prior, Swiss authorities had opened an investigation into Mavridis for a network of extensive money laundering. The investigation would zero in on the company called Martha Overseas Corporation, which was registered in Panama, a known tax haven, that was receiving money via Liechtenstein, another tax haven. These payments coming from Eagle Invest and Finance SA, which was registered in the British Virgin Islands from Reinhard Sikacek, which, again, probably butchering the name on here, but this is a Siemens executive in Germany. Sikacek was arrested in November of 2006, and he would tell Munich prosecutors of dozens of bribery schemes around the world, and he named Mavridis as the man who was in charge of handling payments for Cyprus, Bulgaria, and even parts of former Yugoslavia. Sikacek would tell Greek investigators at the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office that he was responsible for the payment of around €10 million in black funds, just being straight up bribes, to individuals in the Ministry of Defense and the Greek Army. And among them, there were some really high-level names, such as Akis, and I'm going to butcher the name on this again, Sochatzopoulos. I'm just going to call him Akis. Akis over here was the Minister of Defense in the PASOK government, that being the socialist one from 1996 to 2001. Some of the payments were subsequently found in the accounts of two of Akis's associates, Anthony Kantas, who is the Deputy General Director of the Directorate General for Infrastructure, and Paul Nikolaidis, the Vice President of the Greek Arms Industry. Seriously, when I go and talk about this here, I've listed off a lot of details, and there's a lot more that I could be talking about for this part of the story. But in short, 1 year later, the US goes and announces that Siemens was pleading guilty to paying out a whopping $1.36 billion worth of bribes around the world. Again, I could do so much more with just this one company and how much corruption is there. But today's episode is to focus on Greece and its corruption. Again, I could dive into scandal after scandal after scandal because there is never an end, it seems, when it comes to Greece. And because of that, we will be here for the next several months talking about each one if I should try. So no, instead, we are going to have to jump ahead to the more recent issues that the government has faced and why this is something that doesn't seem to have gotten better. Corruption exists within Greece in a more general sense than just issues with major companies like what I've listed. As I mentioned earlier, for centuries, it was part of the culture. Just look at the concept of feklaki. In Greek, feklaki means little envelope, but it's also used in Greek popular culture as a jargon term that refers to bribery of public servants and private companies by Greek citizens in order to expedite getting services. Oh, you don't want to wait in the waiting room here for 2 hours to go see someone about an appointment? Slip a little cash and see what that does. According to this practice, money is stuffed into files or envelopes or other things and passed across desks to secure appointments, to get document approval, get permits, get every kind of thing you could imagine. And for years, this is just how things were done within Greece. And a cash-based economy made this type of corruption and hiding income from authorities to avoid taxes be basically the norm. To combat this, my friends, a series of reforms were needed and launched in the early 2010s. And in 2016 and 2017, the government began to encourage the use of credit cards or debit cards to pay for goods and services to reduce cash-only payments. By January of 2017, taxpayers were only going to be granted tax allowances or deductions when payments were made electronically, with a paper trail of the transactions being necessary so that the government could audit them easily. This was needed to reduce the problem that they were continuously seeing of businesses taking payments for services, but then not issuing an invoice, which was a tactic that was used by companies to avoid paying VAT, which is value added tax or sales tax, as well as income tax. Because go figure, if they say, oh, well, a roofing company, we only worked on 40 roofs this year, but they actually did 60, that means they are taking the income that they made from 20 jobs and then just not reporting it. These reforms are part of the solution that I actually talked about in my previous video that I did on Greece trying to get itself out of debt, because go figure, the government needed to fix its tax issues in order to pay that debt in the first place. But just because the state has more money does not mean that it is going to be used well. And partially fixing one type of corruption does not mean that other parts, like cover-ups, spying, embezzlement, and more, are going to go away. And so to that end, my friends, what I'm going to then bring up here are 3 recent large scandals that, with the current government that is in charge, all 3 of these things have happened. That we're only going to be going into detail about 2 of them, and each one has created problems that seem to just continuously move forward and break people's trust in the judicial structures of the country. 2 of these are related to disasters. You have a train crash in February of 2023 that killed 57 people, and another was a shipwreck off of Greece's Peloponnesian coast that left hundreds of Asian and African migrants drowned. The other one, though, that is a massive spyware scandal that would embroil the government of Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis before this most recent one has now taken the headlines by storm. Individually, when I talk about these things, they are not great things. They are definitely bad. But the fact that they occur one after the other and are combined with suspicious actions of the judicial system and government, that is something that really stinks of a cover-up, and you have the perfect recipe to make society mistrust you. First, Greece's spying scandal, dubbed Predator Gate. This is something that blew up in the summer of 2022 when Nikos Antoulakis, who is the leader of the opposition PASOK Socialist Democratic Party, he discovered illegal spyware on his phone in an attempted wiretap. After this was discovered, it was revealed that he had also been monitored by the state spy apparatus. And as time went on, it was discovered that Predator, which is a highly invasive form of spyware, was on dozens of different phones belonging to ministers, military chiefs, business people, journalists, and more. A big deal, right? Why did this happen? What actually happens? What do they do about this? Well, nothing. And no, I'm not kidding. A report by a deputy prosecutor confirmed that of the 116 spyware targets that were found, only 28 phone numbers were under lawful state surveillance at the time of the attempted hacks. The rest of them, well, perhaps it was just an accident. The Supreme Court certainly thinks so. They would go and dismiss the findings as just a, and I quote, coincidence. And the files containing the surveillance material in question were destroyed. Go figure. Judicial authorities then went and cleared all state officials and state services of any wrongdoings in what opposition parties would call a, quote, day of shame. Seriously, the whole thing stinks of a cover-up, but there is more. Because the train crash, that is something that is still continuing to this very day with its own problems. On the night of February 22nd, 2023, a head-on train collision would kill 57 people, many of them being students. A massive explosion would follow the crash, which caused many of the deaths. And that is something that made people concerned that the cargo train was illegally carrying flammable substances that it was not supposed to. As the dust would settle on the deadliest rail disaster in Greek history, deeper concerns began to arise concerning what role the state had played in it, and also then more importantly, why the state seemed to be covering it up. What do I mean by that, you may wonder? Well, the Greek government sought to attribute the tragedy to purely human error alone, and rejected any and all claims of corruption or systemic flaws in relation to government oversight in critical areas like rail management as well as safety protocols. Investigations by the victims' families and other investigative bodies would determine that authorities had removed debris from the site of the accident within hours of it happening after the crash, including victims' remains that were then just discarded together with tons of dirt in a remote area and forgotten about. Just hidden, covered away. An independent report that was presented in February of 2025 by the National Air and Rail Accident Investigation Authority confirmed that, and I quote, pressure from coordinators to restore the accident scene resulted in the loss of evidentiary material. In other words, the Greek government went in and tried to clean up the mess as fast as possible to the point that it covered up evidence of how things could have gone wrong in the first place. Victims' families and the public would then subsequently raise concerns about possible evidence tampering and the potential obstruction of justice which seems to have taken place. Along with this, authorities would go and remove the train carriages from the scene before a more thorough investigation could be conducted, denying accident investigators and experts that were appointed by victims' families the opportunity to locate evidence in a timely manner at the site before just covering everything up. Security footage, coincidentally enough, from the station where the cargo train was loaded, also vanished. Yeah, go figure. This triggered an investigation by prosecutors into the disappearance of the footage 2 years after the fact. Naturally, the government still maintains that the whole thing was simply just an accident caused by human error, that there was no kind of cover-up, nothing actually took place. But the public has not bought this. And on February 28th, 2025, only around 4 or 5 months ago at this point, 2 years after the accident, hundreds of thousands of people, mostly young people, would go and demonstrate in more than 262 cities and villages across Greece, and many abroad, calling for justice and denouncing the cover-up. It's now estimated that more than 1 million people in Athens alone would participate in the protests, and it is widely regarded as the largest civil unrest in all of Greek history. This was so big, in fact, that this incident nearly brought down the government already earlier this year. The opposition would go and accuse Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis' government of shirking responsibilities over the crash and failing to fix critical issues on the railway, along with covering up evidence that would help shed light into the causes of the disaster. On March 7th, 2025, the Hellenic Parliament would hold a no-confidence vote after a motion was submitted by PASOK, Syriza, New Left, Course of Freedom, and 9 independent MPs. You would think, at this point, all right, after everything that has gone down, the government is probably going to collapse, but no. The vote ends up failing just so, 157 to 136, and the government remains intact. This is a victory for the ruling government, but not a solid one. One that could very easily be reversed this year in light of the most recent farming scandal that has once again exposed massive rot within the Greek government. And so, my friends, as we bring things right back to where it is that we started from in the beginning, allow me to explain some of the details of this case, at least the parts that we know immediately up front. The scandal that we're talking about now revolves around the misuse of European Union agricultural subsidies, which were intended to support farmers and promote agricultural development. These subsidies are part of the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, and are a significant source of funding for many Greek farmers. OPEKEPE, which, oh dear God, that is a mouthful, or the Organization for the Development of Agricultural Production and Rural Development, this was the Greek state agency that was responsible for managing and distributing these subsidies. It was established to implement the CAP in Greece and to support the development of the agricultural sector. So, okay, those are the parts then. How exactly did this fraud work? Well, the fraud was facilitated through a number of complex networks of individuals and officials who would go and exploit loopholes in the system, or just somehow get by them entirely. Some of the mechanisms that were used include false applications, overstated claims, and straight up just fake farms. To explain that further, when talking about false applications, subsidies were awarded to applicants who didn't have any actual connection to agriculture. As an example of this, you have lawyers and other professionals, doctors and more, who were found to have received these subsidies. And we're not talking about agricultural lawyers that are dealing with pasture rights or anything like that. No, just general people applying for and somehow getting subsidies. Others would make claims for things that were not theirs. Applicants would receive funds for land outside of Greece in 34 different cases, including one case it was found where a plot of land in neighboring Northern Macedonia would get subsidies, which Northern Macedonia is not even in the EU, so that should not have happened. Still got paid though. Next up, overstated claims. In comparison to the first part, this is a little bit more understandable as it deals with, well, actual farmers. They just lied about how much land they had and what they were producing. Farmers and applicants would overstate the size of their herds or the extent of their agricultural activities in order to receive higher subsidies. Basically, if you were supposed to receive a set amount of money per goat that you had, a farmer with 100 goats would just lie and say that, oh, he has 500 goats, thus getting 5 times the amount of money that he was supposed to. Bad, to be sure, but at least that one is a little bit more understandable. The last part is where it just gets stupid. Fake farms. Yeah, so subsidies were awarded for farms that straight up did not exist, or better yet, for agricultural activities that make no sense. We're talking about things that are somewhat reasonable, like sheep and goat farms on the island of Crete, where there were none, so they just lied about there being a whole farm. That's in total. Or my personal favorite claim that some people somehow had banana plantations on Mount Olympus. Yeah, you heard me right. Someone was filing paperwork that said that they totally were growing a tropical fruit on the most famous Greek mountain in history and contributed then to the 290 million euros that were stolen. And you then wonder, how did this take so long to catch? Truly baffling. It is reported then that this fraud happened with the knowledge of 2 former agricultural ministers in Mitsotakis' government. You have Makis Viridis, who was in office from 2021 to 2023, and his successor, Lefteris Afganakis, who held the post until 2024. Viridis, who also enjoyed a good reputation as a legal expert, doesn't seem to understand how it is to not commit crime in the first place, was made migration minister in March of just this year. He would very quickly resign at the end of June, saying that he wished to focus on, and I quote, defending his innocence. Which, I mean, sure, okay, he can defend himself. It does not look great. Other state ministers that were implicated in the scandal that I talked about at the beginning of this video would also go and submit their resignations. As it is, my friends, the reports relating to OPEKEPE are not new in the sense that it's not something that just got discovered this summer. No, the report relating to this surfaced several months ago, and it was on June 17th that the European Commission would impose a fine of 415 million euro on Greece, which is likely going to see more fines as time goes on. The EPPO would lodge an official complaint in May and accused Greek authorities of Crete of trying to obstruct investigations, which has, as you've probably seen previously over the course of this video, happened many times. But the government didn't respond to the accusations and took no action. The government just straight up tried to ignore the problem and not do anything until the end of this last month, when the EPPO sent information to Greek parliament about the reported involvement of ministers in criminal activities. And it did so because, according to Greek law, only parliament has the authority to investigate current or former members of the government. That means that for the past month, Greek lawmakers have been trying to study the 3,000-page file submitted by the EPPO that describes a, quote, criminal organization comprising OPEKEPE officials, lawmakers, and individuals who illegally obtained EU money. The file outright names 15 lawmakers, 13 from the ruling ND party, and 1 each from the opposition parties of PASOK and Sirza, as well as regional civil servants and former OPEKEPE executives. It's not pretty, but the information is not fully public yet. Despite the ban on publication, Greeks have been able to read in newspapers in recent days of some of the conversations between officials from the ruling party that were contained in this file. And I kid you not, when going and reading through some of these transcripts, it sounds like straight out of a mafia movie. They include discussions between high-ranking civil servants about how they could, with the help of the justice minister, keep EPPO staff members out of the investigation and hide things. In fact, one of the first to notice the irregularities was actually the head of OPEKEP's internal audit department. You know, the people that are supposed to be checking and making sure there is no fraud, Paraskevi Tikaropoulou. Her superiors responded to her discovering fraud by completely sidelining her, shutting her out of the organization's databases, and even locking her out of her own office. The corruption runs deep. She was since then invited by the EPPO to assist its inquiries and advise on technical and legal issues, so she's probably going to get her revenge one way or another. Still, until the publication ban is lifted, the authenticity of a lot of these conversations is not something that can be proven definitively. But the government is treating it as though it is completely real, which is a positive sign, or I should say, is a positive sign for rooting out corruption. It's not a good sign that it could actually be real. Mitsotakis has not questioned their authenticity, saying, and I quote, "The dialogues that have been uncovered are causing outrage and anger." He would further write in a Facebook post that anyone who is proved to have received EU money that they are not entitled to will be required to pay it back. He would then subsequently go and announce that OPEKEPE was going to be abolished by the end of the year. Strong language, to be sure, but really, at this point, guys, the Prime Minister is desperate, and this could just be all big talk again. The Prime Minister is trying to portray himself as a reformer, as a fighter in the battle against corruption and incompetence in the Greek political system, but as I've already talked about, this is something that has been continuously failed to be done by him, by previous governments, and more. This is not anything that is new within Greece. Whether or not the Greek public is going to buy these words of consolation, well, that remains to be seen, but it's honestly pretty doubtful. The Prime Minister's time in office has been overshadowed by numerous scandals that I've already gone into, including the wiretap scandal, the refugee ship tragedy off of the coast of Pylos, and above all, the thing that is still continuing, the Tempe railway disaster. Each time a scandal has happened, Prime Minister Mitsotakis has pledged to get to the bottom of the scandals, and that there would be consequences for those involved, but ultimately nothing really happens. The Greek state, despite its reforms and improvements over the years, is still a corrupt mess. And that explains why, if you go and look at any kind of surveys about people's trust in the government, over 70% of respondents in any survey across Greece since the beginning of this year do not think that the government is not going to cover something up. In addition, it is the EU, in the form of the European Parliament and the EPPO, and not Greek authorities themselves, that are actually pushing for resolutions of the varying scandals. The wiretap scandal, the train tragedy, and now the farming scandal. It is not Greece that has been trying to pursue this. It is outside entities watching the corruption happening. So, at this point, will the Greek government collapse again? Maybe. Like, look, I'm not going to say anything definitive because the same administration has already gone through multiple scandals and has managed to survive, but this very well could be the straw that breaks the camel's back, just as previous scandals brought down previous governments. But as it stands, we do not know the full extent of this fraud yet. But rest assured, once all the details come out, we are going to be doing a deep dive that is going to explore that specific case here for you all. Thank you for watching, my friends. I appreciate you all for joining me here today, and I will see you all here next time. Let me know in the comment section below what it is that you would like to see next, and if there's any other ideas for things that you want to cover. I am back. I have a lot of things that I need to get back into because from the time in which I was traveling, the world seems to have lit itself on fire. And also, we are finally recovering physically from a lot of the things that we experienced from the beginning of this last month. I appreciate all of you who have stuck by with me and supported me and my family, especially with everything that has happened. It is thanks to you all that we are able to do what it is that we do. So once again, thank you all, and I'll see you here next time. Goodbye, my friends. And also, my friends, I know that I'm inserting this here right now. I know it's a bit random, but I am leading a trip here this next year to Thailand, and there are still some spots that are available. So if you want to sign up and join me and go on an adventure, see some ancient ruins in Ayutthaya and eat some great food and travel and learn some more history, then by all means, click the link down in my description. This is the cheapest trip that I've ever been able to launch, and I'm really proud of it. So by all means, join me. Let's have some fun together.